So government's opinion on Bitcoin in general is irrelevant. I'm a big believer in capitalism, and I'm a big believer in the private sector. That's a good question, as in regards to what's the right way to go about regulating Bitcoin. The real answer is it doesn't matter. Bitcoin was designed in a way to thrive in either of the environments. The worst thing for Bitcoin is not knowing. Bitcoin has done amazingly well in jurisdictions where it's deemed illegal. Because when it's deemed illegal, you know exactly where you stand. And you will still use Bitcoin, you'll just price in the risk of it being illegal. Enforce restrictions on prostitution, enforce restrictions on gambling, enforce restrictions on drugs. Enforcing restrictions on drugs just creates clarity for those people that still want to deal in drugs, whether they're selling them or whether they're using them, and that risk is priced accordingly. And those that participate in those markets understand those risks, and they get compensated for that risk. Bitcoin is the same way. If your jurisdiction deems Bitcoin illegal, it will just be priced in a way that the risk is known. And it can still thrive. Some of the most popular uses of Bitcoin are in jurisdictions where it's illegal. In the United States, for example, the darknet markets and the drug markets are still very popular, and so is gambling. And in places like Venezuela, where there are major price controls and people can't even buy the amount of food that they want, and they're restricted by the government in how much food they can buy, these people are using Bitcoin on the internet and having that food shipped to them from overseas. So Bitcoin just adjusted our regulatory environment. If your jurisdiction deems Bitcoin legal, then that's fine too, because then stores can accept it and no one worries about being arrested for using Bitcoin or selling Bitcoin. And it's debatable whether that's good or bad for the price of Bitcoin, because we have a situation in Japan where Bitcoin is deemed currency, and all these merchants are now accepting Bitcoin, but most of them don't really care about Bitcoin, they just care about money. And when people spend Bitcoin at their stores, it immediately gets converted to their local currency and it goes directly to the bank. So the only people this benefits are the people that already had the Bitcoin. And as these people spend Bitcoin with these merchants, it immediately gets sold, putting a bit of sales pressure on Bitcoin, which is in a way dropping its price a little bit. Money velocity is good, but only when that money is being reused. But if you have velocity of Bitcoin, but it's not a closed loop, and on the other side, that Bitcoin is being sold on exchanges in the open market, it's not really doing very much for the price. In jurisdictions when Bitcoin is deemed illegal, Bitcoin becomes very, very expensive because it becomes very difficult to get, and the people that are selling it to you demand a premium for the risk that they might get arrested for selling you something that is illegal. So in a way, governments cracking down on Bitcoin will make the price of Bitcoin rise almost anywhere in the world, and now people want to buy Bitcoin from jurisdictions where it's legal, like the US perhaps. You can buy Bitcoin in California for maybe 1% above price, and you can just go down to Venezuela, you can go down to other jurisdictions, even just cross the border into Mexico, and immediately sell that Bitcoin for 10% above the market price, because either the market is not developed or the government is cracking down. And it's great that Bitcoin was developed in a way that it can't be shut down.
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And it absolutely will not stop. Ever.
So government's opinion on Bitcoin in general is irrelevant. One of the worst things that the government can do is continue with this total indecision, making people confused, and some will argue that fully legalizing Bitcoin will actually drop the price. If there were no money laundering laws in place and people can do anything with their dollars and anything with their credit cards, if they can spend their money in any way they like without the worry that the government will get them either for tax evasion or arrest them for spending the money the way the government doesn't like them, if those laws didn't exist, we probably wouldn't have Bitcoin today because we wouldn't need it. So having some of the more stricter laws is very good for the survival of Bitcoin. So I did say that mining will become an expense in the future for the private sector. I'm a big believer in capitalism and I'm a big believer in the private sector. When you have an industry that's very invested in the survival of Bitcoin, that industry may actually spend some money mining. I myself have recently bought just one miner in order to support the Bitcoin network for our user-activated soft fork movement to get segregated witness into the code. And I wanted to support it by buying a miner and even mining at a loss just to support what I believe in. And I have some Bitcoin. It's made me a little bit of money over time, and I want to make sure that it stays that way and Bitcoin continues to survive, grow, and be decentralized. And I'm willing to spend some money per year helping that effort. I'm not a big fan of state-sponsored enterprises supporting mining. And that's because governments and states they don't make any money. They just take money from the citizens. They take money from the private sector and they pretty much waste it. Now, of course, they provide some useful services, but in general, you want to have as much private sector involvement in your economy as possible. So when a state decides to use public resources for any kind of mining, whether it's natural resources or Bitcoin, I don't think that's right, because the state would enrich themselves with the spoils of earning the Bitcoin, but they're using other people's money and taxes in order to pay for that mining, to pay for the electricity. So I am a huge critic of the government mining Bitcoin. But another example I will give is I'll go back to Netflix and Amazon. Suppose these giant companies decide to use Bitcoin as a currency, and it removes a lot of friction, and it allows them to enter regions and markets they couldn't have before. One of my favorite examples is something like Netflix, which, as far as I know, isn't in Africa much, nor can it really go into Africa because there's rampant credit card fraud. How can you really go into Africa? It's going to be so hard for you to get people to pay with credit cards, because that's where most credit card fraud seems to be coming from. But allowing people to use Bitcoin basically eliminates the counterfeit of money. And if they do go into a giant continent and they're able to perhaps maybe not double their revenue, but they are able to do really, really well and make a lot of money thanks to Bitcoin, why wouldn't they spend some money on mining just so to make sure that Bitcoin stays this decentralized and censorship-resistant value transfer? But states doing it with other people's money is really not something I can possibly support.